Trial for Murder by Charles Dickens. I have always noticed a prevalent want of courage, even among persons of superior intelligence and culture, as to imparting their own psychic experiences when those have been of spectral illusion. In what I am going to relate, I have no intention of setting up, opposing, or supporting any theory whatever. I had never before had any similar experience, nor have I ever had a similar experience since. It does not signify how many years ago, or how few, a certain murder was committed in England which attracted great attention. We hear more than enough of murderers as they rise in succession to their atrocious eminence, and I would bury the memory of this particular brute. When the murder was first discovered, no suspicion fell on the man who was afterwards brought to trial. It is essential that this fact be remembered. Unfolding at breakfast my morning paper, containing the account of that first discovery, I found it to be deeply interesting, and I read it with close attention. The discovery had been made in a bedroom, and when I laid down the paper, I was aware of a flow, I don't know what to call it, in which I seemed to see that bedroom passing through my room. Though almost instantaneous in its passing, it was perfectly clear, so clear that I distinctly, and with a sense of relief, observed the absence of the dead body from the bed. It was in no romantic place that I had this curious sensation, but in chambers in Piccadilly. I was in my easy chair, and the sensation was accompanied with a peculiar shiver which started the chair from its position. I went to one of the windows to refresh my eyes with the moving objects in the road below. The wind was high. As I looked out, it brought down from the park a quantity of fallen leaves, which a gust took and whirled into a spiral pillar. As the pillar fell and the leaves dispersed, I saw two men on the opposite side of the way. They were one behind the other. The foremost man often looked back over his shoulder. The second man followed him, with his right hand menacingly raised. In passing before my windows, both men stared up at me. I saw their two faces very distinctly, and I knew that I could recognize them anywhere. Not that I had consciously noticed anything very remarkable in either face, except that the man who went first had an unusually lowering appearance, and that the face of the man who followed him was of the colour of impure wax. As the circumstances of the murder gradually unravelling took stronger possession of the public mind, I kept them away from mine by knowing as little about them as was possible. But I knew that a verdict of wilful murder had been found against the suspected murderer, and that he had been committed to Newgate for trial. I was standing in my bedroom late one night, facing towards the closed door of my dressing-room. I saw it open, and a man look in who very earnestly beckoned to me. That man was the man who had gone second of the two along Piccadilly, and whose face was the colour of impure wax. The figure drew back and closed the door. With no longer pause than was made by my crossing the bedroom, I opened the dressing-room door and looked in. I felt no inward expectation of seeing the figure in the dressing-room, and I did not see it there. Reflecting on it, I was absolutely certain that I had never seen that face before except on the one occasion in Piccadilly. At daylight I fell into a heavy sleep, from which I was awakened by my servant John Derrick coming to my bedside with a paper in his hand. It was a summons to me to serve upon a jury at the forthcoming sessions of the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. For a day or two I was undecided whether to respond to this call or take no notice of it. Ultimately, I decided, as a break in the monotony of my life, that I would go. The appointed morning was a raw morning in the month of November. I took my seat in the place appropriated to jurors in waiting, Soon afterwards the judges, 2 in number, entered and took their seats. The buzz in the court was awfully hushed. The direction was given to put the murderer to the bar. He appeared, and in that same instant I recognized in him the first of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. If my name had been called then, I doubt if I could have answered to it audibly. But it was called about 6th or 8th in the panel, and I was by that time able to say, "Here." Now observe. As I stepped into the box, the prisoner, who had been looking on attentively, but with no sign of concern, became violently agitated and beckoned to his attorney. The prisoner's wish to challenge me was so manifest that it occasioned a pause, during which the attorney whispered with his client and shook his head. I afterwards had it from that gentleman that the prisoner's first affrighted words to him were, "At all hazards, challenge that man," but that as he would give no reason for it, and admitted that he had not even known my name until he heard it called and I appeared, it was not done. I was chosen foreman of the jury. On the second morning of the trial, after evidence had been taken for 2 hours, happening to cast my eyes over my brother jurymen, I found an inexplicable difficulty in counting them. I counted them several times, yet always with the same difficulty. In short, I made them 1 too many. I touched the brother juryman whose place was next me, and I whispered to him, "Oblige me by counting us." He looked surprised by the request, but turned his head and counted. "Why," says he suddenly, "we're 30... But no, it's not possible. No, we are 12. According to my counting that day, we were always right in detail, but in the gross we were always 1 too many. There was no appearance, no figure to account for it, but I had now an inward foreshadowing of the figure that was surely coming. The jury were housed at the London Tavern. We all slept in one large room, and we were constantly under the eye of the officer sworn to hold us in safe keeping. His name was Mr. Harker. When we turned into our 12 beds at night, Mr. Harker's bed was drawn across the door. On the night of the second day, not being disposed to lie down, and seeing Mr. Harker sitting on his bed, I went and sat beside him and offered him a pinch of snuff. As Mr. Harker's hand touched mine in taking it from my box, a peculiar shiver crossed him, and he said, "Who is this?" Following Mr. Harker's eyes, and looking along the room, I saw again the figure I expected, the second of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. I rose and advanced a few steps, then stopped, and looked round at Mr. Harker. He was quite unconcerned, laughed, and said in a pleasant way, "I thought for a moment we had a 13th juryman without a bed. But I see it is the moonlight." Making no revelation to Mr. Harker, I watched what the figure did. It stood for a few moments by the bedside of each of my 11 brother jurymen. It seemed from the action of the head merely to look down pensively at each recumbent figure. It took no notice of me or of my bed, which was that nearest to Mr. Harker's. It seemed to go out where the moonlight came in, through a high window, as by an aerial flight of stairs. Next morning, at breakfast, it appeared that everybody present had dreamed of the murdered man last night, except myself and Mr. Harker. I now felt as convinced that the second man who had gone down Piccadilly was the murdered man. Generally, when we were shut up together in Mr. Harker's custody, we had from the first naturally discussed the day's proceedings. On the 5th day, the case for the prosecution being closed, our discussion was more animated and serious. Among our number was a vestryman, the densest idiot I have ever seen at large, who met the plainest evidence with the most preposterous objections, and who was sided with by 2 flabby parochial parasites. When these mischievous blockheads were at their loudest, which was towards midnight, I again saw the murdered man. He stood grimly behind them, beckoning to me. On my going towards them and striking into the conversation, he immediately retired. Whenever a knot of my brother jurymen laid their heads together, and whenever their comparison of notes was going against him, he would solemnly beckon to me. The figure was now in court continually, and it never there addressed itself to me, but always to the person who was speaking at the time. For instance, the throat of the murdered man had been cut straight across. In the opening speech for the defence, it was suggested that the deceased might have cut his own throat. At that very moment, the figure, with its throat in the dreadful condition referred to, stood at the speaker's elbow, motioning across and across its windpipe, now with the right hand, now with the left, vigorously suggesting to the speaker himself the impossibility of such a wound having been self-inflicted. So with the venerable sagacious judge who conducted the trial. When the case was over, and he settled himself and his papers to sum up, the murdered man, entering by the judge's door, advanced to his lordship's desk and looked eagerly over his shoulder at the pages of his notes which he was turning. A change came over his lordship's face. His hand stopped. The peculiar shiver that I knew so well passed over him. He faltered. "Excuse me, gentlemen, for a few moments. I am somewhat oppressed by the vitiated air," and did not recover until he had drunk a glass of water. We retired to consider at 7 minutes before 10 at night. At length we prevailed, and finally the jury returned into court at 10 minutes past 12. The murdered man stood directly opposite the jury box. As I took my place, his eyes rested on me. He seemed satisfied, and slowly shook a great grey veil which he carried on his arm for the first time over his head and whole form. As I gave in our verdict, "Guilty," the veil collapsed, all was gone, and his place was empty. The murderer, being asked by the judge whether he had anything to say before sentence of death should be passed upon him, indistinctly muttered something which was described in the leading newspapers of the following day as a few rambling, incoherent, and half-audible words. The remarkable declaration that he really made was this: "My lord, I knew I was a doomed man when the foreman of my jury came into the box. My lord, I knew he would never let me off, because, before I was taken, he somehow got to my bedside in the night, woke me, and put a rope round my neck.